And now it's time to talk about nationalism in Italy, how Giuseppe Verdi helped keep it all together. The word risorgimento, directly translated from Italian, means rise again. This movement was a successful attempt to free the individual Italian states from foreign rule and reunite them into one single country. This movement occurred in the early 19th century, shortly after the French Revolution came to an end in 1815, and lasted until 1871, when Rome became the official capital of Italy. This movement endured 3 separate wars of independence, which all occurred during the 19th century. Directly following the end of the French Revolution in 1815, many Italian citizens were not happy with the current political situation of many states being dominated by so many different lands, primarily Austria. So, many came up with secret societies to promote the unification of the Italian states. The first prominent society was Giovine Italia, or Young Italy, founded by Giuseppe Mazzini in 1831. Educating the masses was their primary focus, as they believed the only way Italy could be freed was through a popular initiative. They also believed in insurrection, which is defined as an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This group sparked the formation of other similar groups all across Italy in the 1830s. However, after a severely unsuccessful insurrection in Piedmont, the group dissolved because many of its members were killed. Mazzini escaped in Switzerland, but even though Giovine Italia was gone, their ideals and beliefs pressed on throughout Italy. According to Mazzini, ideas ripen quickly when nourished by the blood of martyrs. The Risorgimento movement carried on. Giuseppe Verdi's ideals aligned with Mazzini's, which is why the two were in cahoots together to free Italy. Giuseppe Verdi lived from 1813 to 1901 and is quite possibly one of the most influential Italian composers of all time. Even though it is said that Verdi was very private in his own opinions, especially when it came to politics, he sympathized deeply with the Risorgimento movement. Because of these sympathies and incredible composition skills, he became a national icon for the reunification of Italy. He composed over 30 different operas, but the most influential one on Italian politics was Nabucco, which he composed in 1842. Mazzini deeply believed in the power of music, particularly opera, because he believed it was one of the most powerful mediums for the expression of spiritual and political ideals. Because of this, he personally asked Verdi to write a national anthem for Italy. Even though he requested that Verdi write a separate patriotic hymn for the Risorgimento movement, one of Verdi's opera choruses, Va Pensiero, became the unofficial anthem of Italy because of its popularity among the peoples. Verdi toyed with the idea of giving his opera choruses more melodic lines and having them represent actual people, which was a new idea even in the opera world at that time. Va Pensiero, also known as the chorus of the Hebrew slaves, occurs in the third act of Nabucco, when the chorus of the Hebrew slaves are lamenting the loss of their homeland. Obviously, this was received well by the Italian people because they could directly relate to this sense of loss. In fact, a rumor said that during the first premiere of the opera in Milan, after Va Pensiero finished, the entire audience rose to their feet and shouted for an encore of the song. Va Pensiero gave the Italian people a voice during the First Italian War of Independence. They could finally be heard and use Verdi's music as a uniting component to bring them together. In fact, the Italian people came up with a clever little saying, Viva Verdi, using Verdi's name as an acronym for Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia. This was an acronym for Victor Emmanuel II, the son of Charles Albert, the King of Sardinia. Albert's main effort went to unifying the Italian states and after their victory in the First Italian War of Independence with Austria, he recommended that his son, Victor Emmanuel II, become the leader of Italy. The people of Italy viewed this as a great success, which is why they chose this acronym, not only to praise Victor Emmanuel II, but also Giuseppe Verdi himself. Giuseppe Verdi had solidified his role as an icon in the Risorgimento movement, and this fame would live on for the rest of his life.
Richard Wagner was a German composer who is most famously known for his operas. Wagner wrote his operas in Gesamtkunstwerk style, which meant total work of art, or a piece of art that encompasses many other art forms. Almost all of Wagner's works were inspired by German myths and invoke the idea that Germany should be a united nation. Some of his best-known works that use Germanic myths are Der Ring des Nibelungen, also known as the Ring Cycle, Tristan und Isolde, a German version of Romeo and Juliet, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, and Parsifal, a German version of the Holy Grail, where the king causes all of his people to become ill. A young knight takes over the kingdom and finds the Holy Grail, and everyone is brought together in common religion. After Wagner was involved in the uprising in Dresden in 1849, Wagner had to flee to Paris and then to Zurich. Wagner spent 12 years in exile from Germany and wrote a series of essays that were titled The Artwork of the Future, in which he expressed his opinions on Jewish musicians. He said that Jews had no connection to the German spirit and that they only created music for popularity and money. This meant that they were incapable of creating music that Wagner considered genuine works of art. This publication led to protests outside of the operas in Vienna and Mannheim. The Nazis took Wagner as their patron composer because of his views on achieving a unified Germany and for Hitler's personal liking of his music. The Nazis took the ideas that they liked about Wagner's views on nationalism and used these views in their propaganda, but did not particularly care for his music. Hitler's admiration of Wagner's music was, however, very evident, and the Nazis had Wagner's music at many of their events because Hitler insisted on it. It is rumored that Wagner's music was played over the loudspeakers in concentration camps, and that Jewish musicians were held captive or forced to perform his works, though this was never proven. After this, there was a long-standing ban on Wagner's music in the State of Israel. Wagner's famous Gesamtkunstwerk style created a platform for many arts to be performed together in a united work, and this very well could constitute as a metaphor for Wagner's political views on German nationalism.
1848 stained Europe with the blood of revolution. Austria and France dominated most of Europe, dividing countries like Germany and Italy into several different kingdoms. The only thing these kingdoms had in common was their language. Revolutionaries were after unification. That meant overthrowing Austria and France. Eventually, Germany and Italy gained their independence and were able to unify the kingdoms divided within each respective country into one nation. Tension was high, and it only continued to escalate. Verdi and Wagner were thirsty to taste victory. Both composers were very involved in the political aspects of their countries. They were opinionated on how a country should be ran and by who it should be ran. Through their music and their writings, they were influenced the thoughts of people. They encouraged uprisings, and hid secret messages while still pleasing the enemy's ear. Let's go back to Italy, 1842, to the premiere of Verdi's opera Nabucco. Giuseppe Verdi, a young progressive, knew that defeating Austria would be difficult without a high social morale. The opera depicts the struggle of the Israelites who long for the Promised Land, especially in the chorus of Va Pensiero, also known as the chorus of the Hebrew slaves. This chorus was seen as a call to overthrow the Austrian and French Empire. The Italians identified the Promised Land as a unified nation. Short after, Verdi's name was used as an acronym that spelled out Victor Emmanuel Re d'Italia, who was the king of Sardinia at that time. Verdi continued to write operas to instill hope in the hearts of the Italians. He knew he would be more of an impact as a composer rather than a politician. La Traviata and Rigoletto are among his most famous works. He depicts a prostitute in La Traviata who has a better heart than a nobleman. And in Rigoletto, he tells the story of a man who gets his life spared, although he plots to kill another man. Stories like these were used to give the common people a better image. In 1861, once Italy was unified, Verdi was appointed to the first parliament. Both composers were influential in the way society saw revolution. They were able to mold their minds into believing what was best for their country. Verdi opted to use music as a way into political aspects, while Wagner forcefully had to use readings and writings in order to instill some hope and victory vigor into the German culture.
Perhaps the greatest difference between Wagner and Verdi was how their countries perceived them during their life and 100 years after their life. On the centennial of Verdi's death, the Italian Minister of Culture compared Verdi to an Italian Shakespeare. However, during Verdi's life, there were times when he was scorned by his countrymen and neighbors, such as when he was living with a, quote, fallen woman. In fact, this particular adversity inspired La Traviata, and other adversities faced during Verdi's life inspired other operas. Wagner, in comparison, might have been more respected by his countrymen during his life and shortly after his life than 100 years after he died. During his lifetime, he was the preeminent German composer. 20 years after he died, German copyright law was almost revised to lengthen the amount of time his family would get to exploit the copyright of his works. In particular, one work that he wanted exclusively performed in Germany. Not long after that, Hitler came into power and ushered in a Wagner Renaissance, which was short-lived, as after the war Germans and other nations' citizens became suspicious of art that was too heavily associated with the Nazi Party, which did not just include Wagner's works, but also the works of Hugo Distler and several other composers. 100 years and more after Wagner's death, his nationalism and association with the Nazi Party still stigmatizes his works, preventing him from holding as highly praised a position among German composers as Verdi does among Italian ones. The two composers' popularity has also varied according to the value prescribed to nationalism at various times in history. Wagner became ever more popular as Germans became more nationalistic and more militaristic. This was not just because Wagner was an esteemed German composer. There are many of those, including Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, the Schumanns, but because Wagner himself blatantly endorsed nationalist attitudes during his lifetime. Thus, when Germany's militaristic ambitions faded away after World War II, Wagner also suffered a decline in popularity. Verdi, on the other hand, was not as vocal about his nationalism as Wagner. He did support Italian unification, but was not as prolific on the subject as Wagner was about German nationalist topics. In fact, the opera chorus Verdi wrote that has become the anthem of Italy was intended to just be an opera chorus. On the times he did write it for explicitly nationalistic purposes, it was less popular than the music Wagner explicitly wrote for nationalistic purposes. Verdi's less aggressive nationalism, however, has made him a far less controversial figure than Wagner in the modern age. Ironically, though Wagner's explicitly national works achieved a far greater popularity than Verdi's explicitly nationalistic works, they were also not praised except by ardent Wagnerians for their nationalistic purpose during Wagner's lifetime. According to Josserand, Wagner was upset that his fellow Germans, upon hearing Ring des Nibelungen, felt no call to do battle for the German spirit. Despite both composers being associated with nationalistic movements in their countries, history has treated them very differently. While Wagner has oscillated from being claimed as Germany's greatest composer to being almost a pariah in Western music with the rise and fall of the German nationalist movement, Verdi's quiet patriotism has allowed him and his music to stay, without doubt, as Italy's most loved composer.
As previously mentioned, each composer, while following the same basic idea of nationalism through music, is remembered in a very different light. As William stated earlier, Wagner was seen as a rather controversial character, and his unfortunate association with the Nazi Party during World War II certainly didn't help his reputation. Verdi, on the other hand, was remembered as the epitome of Italian pride and nationalism during the Risorgimento. In fact, Verdi's reputation as the face of Italian resistance and unification earned him an acrostic on his name, Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, referring, of course, to Victor Emmanuel, son of Charles Albert and King of Italy from the late 19th century. These two composers are often referred to as giants in the world of opera, Verdi as the Colossus of Italy and Wagner as the Colossus of Germany. While these two were similar in the sense that they strived for revolution and unification, they could not have been more different in their sense of self-worth. Verdi is remembered as a man that humbly fought through his challenges and triumphantly came out of periods of despair and produced major success, such as when he lost his 2 children and his wife in 1840, and he then produced Nabucco, bringing back his immense love for music. We see Verdi as a very humble character, also because of how calm his funeral was. It was very quiet, without music or singing, just as he had requested it. Wagner's demeanor was another matter entirely. Though he is much more remembered as a revolutionary titan of music than Verdi seems, his personality was once compared to that of an insane egotist, and one of his quotes truly shows this. He was once quoted as saying, "I am not made like other people. I must have brilliance and beauty and light. The world owes me what I need. I can't live on a miserable organist pittance like your master, Bach." Even with his unique way with words, Wagner managed to bring in sponsors continuously, and he even produced the Ring Cycle with a stipend from two very well-off women in Switzerland, where he was forced to move after having to flee from an arrest warrant in Germany. These composers still have their music performed as a political statement even to this day, as we see in Rachel Orzek's article, Nabucco and Zion, Place, Metaphor, and Nationalism in an Israeli Production of Verdi's Opera. Since established in 1981, the Israeli opera has performed Verdi's famous politically powered work 4 times, in 1995, 96, 2003, and 2010. In fact, a performance of Nabucco was set for 1988 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the State of Israel. This performance was to feature the London Royal Philharmonic, and it was supposed to happen just outside the walls of Old Jerusalem. Unfortunately, ongoing conflict with the Palestinians uprising in the West Bank caused the performance to be cancelled. In 2010, the most recent Israeli performance of Nabucco was staged at the old site of Masada. According to Israeli national mythology, the abandoned fortress of Masada provided shelter for Jews fleeing Jerusalem in the 1st century after the Romans conquered their city during the Great Revolt. Even with growing tension on the Gaza Strip, the performance went on and sentiment grew throughout the nation for the Israeli people after a very profound performance of Verdi's great work. Wagner's music is still some of the most important music that we should come to know and love, but unfortunately, we don't see much of Wagner's work performed as a political statement in the modern day, probably due to the fact that the Third Reich enjoyed his music, but his music was nevertheless a symbol of German nationalism throughout the mid-20th century. These composers revolutionized how we use music, and even to this day, music is often used as a way to vent political opinions. From music during the Vietnam War that discouraged the conflict to music after the attacks on September 11th, music is more than just an art form that's fun to listen to and perform. Music continues to grow into a different entity in which we can express our innermost thoughts,